Chapter 21 of Journey to the Center of the Earth. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Dave K. of Southern Minnesota. Chapter 21 Under the Ocean. By the next day we had nearly forgotten all our past sufferings. The first sensation I had experienced was surprise at not being thirsty, and I actually asked myself the reason. The running stream, which flowed in rippling wavelets at my feet, was the satisfactory reply. We breakfasted with a good appetite, and then drank our fill of the excellent water. I felt myself quite a new man, ready to go anywhere my uncle chose to lead. I began to think. Why should not a man as seriously convinced as my uncle succeed, with so excellent a guide as worthy Hans, and so devoted a nephew as myself? These were the brilliant ideas which now invaded my brain. Had the proposition now been made to go back to the summit of Mount Snæfell's, I should have declined the offer in a most indignant manner. But fortunately there was no question of going up. We are about to descend farther into the interior of the earth. "Let us be moving," I cried, awakening the echoes of the old world. We resumed our march on Thursday at 8 o'clock in the morning. The great granite tunnel, as it went round by sinuous and winding ways, presented every now and then sharp turns, and in fact all the appearance of a labyrinth. Its direction, however, was in general toward the southwest. My uncle made several pauses in order to consult his compass. The gallery now began to trend downwards in a horizontal direction, with about 2 inches of fall in every furlong. The murmuring stream flowed quietly at our feet. I could not but compare it to some familiar spirit guiding us through the earth, and I dabbled my fingers in its tepid water, which sang like a naiad as we progressed. My good humor began to assume a mythological character. As for my uncle, he began to complain of the horizontal character of the road. His route, he found, began to be indefinitely prolonged, instead of sliding down the celestial ray, according to his expression. But we had no choice, and as long as our road led toward the center, however little progress we made, there was no reason to complain. Moreover, from time to time the slopes were much greater. The naiad sang more loudly, and we began to dip downward in earnest. As yet, however, I felt no painful sensation. I had not got over the excitement of the discovery of water. That day and the next we did a considerable amount of horizontal, and relatively little vertical, traveling. On Friday evening, the 10th of July, according to our estimation, we ought to have been 30 leagues to the southeast of Reykjavik, and about 2 leagues and a half deep. We now received a rather startling surprise. Under our feet there opened a horrible well. My uncle was so delighted that he actually clapped his hands as he saw how steep and sharp was the descent. "Ah, ah!" he cried in rapturous delight. "This takes us a long way. Look at the projections of the rock. Ha!" he claimed. "It's a fearful staircase." Hans, however, who in all our troubles had never given up the ropes, took care so to dispose of them as to prevent any accidents. Our descent then began. I dare not call it a perilous descent, for I was already too familiar with that sort of work to look upon it as anything but a very ordinary affair. This well was a kind of narrow opening in the massive granite of the kind known as a fissure. The contraction of the terrestrial scaffolding, when it suddenly cooled, had been evidently the cause. If it had ever served in former times as a kind of funnel through which passed the eruptive masses vomited by Snæfell's, I was at a loss to explain how it had left no mark. We were, in fact, descending in a spiral, something like those winding staircases in use in modern homes. We were compelled every quarter of an hour, or thereabouts, to sit down in order to rest our legs. Our calves ached. We then seated ourselves on some projecting rock with our legs hanging over, and gossiped while we ate a mouthful, drinking still from the pleasantly warm running stream which had not deserted us. It is scarcely necessary to say that in this curiously shaped fissure the Hansbach had become a cascade, to the detriment of its size. It was still, however, sufficient and more for our wants. Besides, we knew that, as soon as the declivity ceased to be so abrupt, the stream must resume its peaceful course. At this moment it reminded me of my uncle, his impatience and rage, while when it flowed more peacefully I pictured to myself the placidity of the Icelandic guide. During the whole of 2 days, the 6th and 7th of July, we followed the extraordinary spiral staircase of the fissure, penetrating 2 leagues farther into the crust of the earth, which put us 5 leagues below the level of the sea. On the 8th, however, at 12 o'clock in the day, the fissure suddenly assumed a much more gentle slope, still trending in a southeast direction. The road now became comparatively easy, and at the same time dreadfully monotonous. It would have been difficult for matters to have turned out otherwise. Our peculiar journey had no chance of being diversified by landscape and scenery. At all events, such was my idea. At length, on Wednesday the 15th, we were actually 7 leagues, 21 miles, below the surface of the earth, and 50 leagues distant from the mountain of Snæfell's, though, if the truth be told, we were very tired. Our health had resisted all suffering, and was in a most satisfactory state. Our traveller's box of medicaments had not even been opened. My uncle was careful to note every hour the indications of the compass, of the manometer, and of the thermometer, all of which he afterwards published in his elaborate philosophical and scientific account of our remarkable voyage. He was therefore able to give an exact relation of the situation. When, therefore, he informed me that we were 50 leagues in a horizontal direction distant from our starting point, I could not suppress a loud exclamation. "What is the matter now?" cried my uncle. "Nothing very important. Only an idea has entered my head," was my reply. "Well, out with it, my boy." "It is my opinion that if your calculations are correct, we are no longer under Iceland." "Do you think so?" "We can very easily find out," I replied, pulling out a map and compasses. "You see," I said, after careful measurement, "that I am not mistaken. We are far beyond Cape Portland, and those 50 leagues to the southeast will take us into the open sea." "Under the open sea!" cried my uncle, rubbing his hands with a delighted air. "Yes," I cried, "no doubt old ocean flows over our heads." "Well, my dear boy, what can be more natural? Do you not know that in the neighborhood of Newcastle there are coal mines which have been worked far out under the sea?" Now my worthy uncle, the professor, no doubt regarded this discovery as a very simple fact, but to me the idea was by no means a pleasant one. And yet, when one came to think the matter over seriously, what mattered it whether the plains and mountains of Iceland were suspended over our devoted heads, or the mighty billows of the Atlantic Ocean? The whole question rested on the solidity of the granite roof above us. However, I soon got used to the ideal, for the passage now level, now running down, and still always to the southeast, kept going deeper and deeper into the profound abysses of Mother Earth. 3 days later, on the 18th of July, on a Saturday, we reached a kind of vast grotto. My uncle here paid Hans his usual rix dollars, and it was decided that the next day should be a day of rest. End of chapter.
Chapter 22 of Journey to the Center of the Earth. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Simon Wainwright. Journey to the Center of the Earth by Jules Verne. Chapter 22. Sunday, below ground. I awoke on Sunday morning without any sense of hurry and bustle, attendant on an immediate departure, though the day to be devoted to repose and reflection was spent under such strange circumstances, and in so wonderful a place. The idea was a pleasant one. Besides, we all began to get used to this kind of existence. I had almost ceased to think of the sun, of the moon, of the stars, of the trees, houses, and towns, in fact, about any terrestrial necessities. In our peculiar position, we were far above such reflections. The grotto was a vast and magnificent hall. Along its granitic soil the stream flowed placidly and pleasantly. So great a distance was it now from its fiery source that its water was scarcely lukewarm, and could be drunk without delay or difficulty. After a frugal breakfast, the professor made up his mind to devote some hours to putting his notes and calculations in order. In the first place, he said, I have a good many to verify and prove, in order that we may know our exact position. I wish to be able, on our return to the upper regions, to make a map of our journey, a kind of vertical section of the globe, which will be, as it were, the profile of the expedition. That would indeed be a curious work, uncle, but can you make your observations with anything like certainty and precision? I can. I have never on any occasion failed to note with great care the angles and slopes. I am certain as to have made no mistake. Take the compass and examine how she points. I looked at the instrument with care. East 1/4 southeast. Very good, resumed the professor, noting the observation and going through some rapid calculations. I make out that we have journeyed 250 miles from the point of our departure. Then the mighty waves of the Atlantic are rolling over our heads. Certainly, and at this very moment it is possible that fierce tempests are raging above, and that men and ships are battling against the angry blast just over our heads. It is quite within the range of possibility, rejoined my uncle, smiling. And that whales are playing in shoals, thrashing the bottom of the sea, the roof of our adamantine prison. Be quite at rest at that point. There is no danger of their breaking through. But to return to our calculations, we are to the southeast, 250 miles from the base of Sneffels, and according to my preceding notes, I think we have gone 16 leagues in a downward direction. 16 leagues! 50 miles! I cried. I am sure of it. But that is the extreme limit allowed by science for the thickness of the earth's crust, I replied, referring to my geological studies. I do not contravene that assertion, was his quiet answer. And at this stage of our journey, according to all known laws on the increase of heat, there should be here a temperature of 1500 degrees of Reaumur. There should be, you say, my boy? In which case this granite would not exist, but in a state of fusion. But you perceive, my boy, that it is not so, and that facts, as usual, are very stubborn things, overruling all theories. I am forced to yield to the evidence of my senses, but I am nevertheless very much surprised. What heat does the thermometer really indicate? Continued the philosopher. 27/6. So that science is wrong by 1474 degrees and 4/10, according to which it is demonstrated that the proportional increase in temperature is an exploded error. Humphrey Davy here shines forth in all his glory. He is right, and I have acted wisely to believe him. Have you any answer to make to this statement? Had I chosen to have spoken, I might have said a great deal. I in no way admitted the theory of Humphrey Davy. I still held out for the theory of proportional increase of heat, though I did not feel it. I was far more willing to allow that this chimney of an extinct volcano was covered by lava, of a kind refractory to heat, in fact, a bad conductor, which did not allow the great increase of temperature to percolate through its sides. The hot water jet supported my view of the matter. But without entering on a long and useless discussion, or seeking for new arguments to controvert my uncle, I contented myself with taking up facts as they were. Well, sir, I take for granted that all your calculations are correct, but allow me to draw from them a rigorous and definite conclusion. Go on, my boy, have your say, cried my uncle good-humoredly. At the place where we now are, under the latitude of Iceland, the terrestrial depth is about 1,583 leagues, 1,583 and a quarter. Well, suppose we say 1,600 in round numbers. Now, out of a voyage of 1,600 leagues, we have completed 16. As you say, what then? At the expense of a diagonal journey of no less than 85 leagues exactly. We have been 20 days about it. Exactly 20. Now, 16 is the 100th part of our contemplated expedition. If we go on in this way, we shall be 2,000 days. That is about 5 years and a half going down. The professor folded his arms, listened, but did not speak. Without counting that if a vertical descent of 16 leagues cost us a horizontal of 85, we shall have to go about 8,000 leagues to the southeast, and we must therefore come out somewhere in the circumference long before we can hope to reach the center. Bother your calculations, cried my uncle in one of his old rages. On what basis do they rest? How do you know that this passage does not take us direct to the end we require? Moreover, I have in my favor, fortunately, a precedent. What I have undertaken to do, another has done, and he having succeeded, why should I not be equally successful? I hope indeed you will be. Still, I suppose I may be allowed to. You are allowed to hold your tongue, cried Professor Hardwigg, when you talk so unreasonably as this. I saw at once that the old doctorial professor was still alive in my uncle, and fearful to rouse his angry passions, I dropped the unpleasant subject. Now then, he explained, consult the manometer. What does that indicate? A considerable amount of pressure. Very good. You see, then, that by descending slowly and by gradually accustoming ourselves to the density of this lower atmosphere, we shall not suffer. Well, I suppose not, except it may be a certain amount of pain in the ears, was my rather grim reply. That, my dear boy, is nothing, and you will easily get rid of that source of discomfort by bringing the exterior air to communication with the air contained in your lungs. Perfectly, said I, for I had quite made up my mind in no wise to contradict my uncle. I should fancy almost that I should experience a certain amount of satisfaction in making a plunge into this dense atmosphere. Have you taken note of how wonderfully sound is propagated? Of course I have. There can be no doubt that a journey into the interior of the earth would be an excellent cure for deafness. But then, uncle, I ventured mildly to observe, this density will continue to increase. Yes, according to a law which, however, is scarcely defined. It is true that the intensity of weight will diminish just in proportion to the depth to which we go. You know very well that it is on the surface of the earth that its action is most powerfully felt, while, on the contrary, in the very center of the earth, bodies cease to have any weight at all. I know that is the case, but as we progress, will not the atmosphere finally assume the density of water? I know it. When placed under the pressure of 710 atmospheres, cried my uncle, with imperturbable gravity. And when we are still lower down, I ask with natural anxiety, well, lower down, the density will become even greater. Then how shall we be able to make our way through this atmospheric fog? Well, my worthy nephew, we must ballast ourselves by filling our pockets with stones, said Professor Hardwigg. Faith, uncle, you have an answer for everything, was my only reply. I began to feel that it was unwise of me to go any farther into the wide field of hypotheses, for I should certainly have reviewed some difficulty, or rather impossibility, that would have enraged the professor. It was evident, nevertheless, that the air, under a pressure which might be multiplied by thousands of atmospheres, would end by becoming perfectly solid, and that then, admitting our bodies resisted the pressure, we should have to stop in spite of all the reasonings in the world. Facts overcome all arguments. But I thought it best not to urge this argument. My uncle would simply have quoted the example of Saknussemm. Supposing the learned Icelander's journey ever really to have taken place, there was one simple answer to be made. In the 16th century, neither the barometer nor the manometer had been invented. How then could Saknussemm have been able to discover when he did reach the center of the earth? This unanswerable and learned objection I, however, kept to myself, and bracing up my courage, awaited the course of events, little aware of how adventurous yet were to be the incidents of our remarkable journey. The rest of this day of leisure and repose was spent in calculation and conversation. I made it a point to agree with the professor in everything, but I envied the perfect indifference of Hans, who, without taking any such trouble about the cause and effect, went blindly onwards wherever destiny chose to lead him. End of chapter 22. Recording by Simon Wainwright. Chapter 23 of Journey to the Center of the Earth. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Simon Wainwright. Journey to the Center of the Earth by Jules Verne. Chapter 23. Alone. It must in all truth be confessed, things as yet had gone well, and I should have acted in bad taste to have complained, if the true medium of our difficulties did not increase. It was within the range of possibility that we might ultimately reach the end of our journey. Then what glory would be ours! I began, in the newly aroused ardor of my soul, to speak enthusiastically to the professor. Well, was I serious? The whole state in which we existed was a mystery, and it was impossible to know whether or not I was earnest. For several days after our memorable halt, the slopes became more rapid. Some were even of a most frightful character, almost vertical, so that we were forever going down into the solid interior mass. During some days we actually descended 1.5 leagues, even 2 leagues toward the center of the earth. The descents were sufficiently perilous, and while we were engaged in them we learned fully to appreciate the marvelous coolness of our guide Hans. Without him we should have been wholly lost. The grave and impassible Icelander devoted himself to us with the most incomprehensible sang-froid and ease, and thanks to him many a dangerous pass was got over, where but for him we should inevitably have stuck fast. His silence increased every day. I think that we began to be influenced by this peculiar trait in his character. It is certain that the inanimate objects by which you are surrounded have a direct action on the brain. It must be that a man who shuts himself up between 4 walls must lose the faculty of associating ideas and words. How many persons condemned to the horrors of solitary confinement have gone mad, simply because the thinking faculties have lain dormant. During the 2 weeks that followed our last interesting conversation, there occurred nothing worthy of being especially recorded. I have, while writing these memoirs, taxed my memory in vain for one incident of travel during this peculiar period. But the next event to be related is terrible indeed. Its very memory, even now, makes my soul shudder and my blood run cold. It was on the 7th of August. Our constant and successive descents had taken us quite 30 leagues into the interior of the earth. That is to say, that there were above us 30 leagues, nearly 100 miles of rocks and oceans and continents and towns, to say nothing of living inhabitants. We were in a southeasterly direction, about 200 leagues from Iceland. Now, the memorable day, the tunnel had begun to assume an almost horizontal course. I was on this occasion walking in front. My uncle had charge of one of Ruhmkorff's coils. I had possession of the other. By means of its light I was busy examining the different layers of granite. I was completely absorbed in my work. Suddenly halting and turning round, I found that I was alone. Well, thought I to myself, I have certainly been walking too fast, or else Hans and my uncle have stopped to rest. The best thing I can do is to go back and find them. Luckily, there is very little ascent to tire me. I accordingly retraced my steps, and while doing so walked for at least a quarter of an hour. Rather uneasy, I paused and looked eagerly around. Not a living soul. I called aloud. No reply. My voice was lost amid the myriad cavernous echoes it aroused. I began for the first time to feel seriously uneasy. A cold shiver shook my whole body, and perspiration, chill and terrible, burst upon my skin. I must be calm, I said, speaking aloud, as boys whistle to drive away fear. There can be no doubt that I shall find my companions. There cannot be two roads. It is certain that I was considerably ahead. All I have to do is to go back. Having come to this determination, I ascended the tunnel for at least half an hour, unable to decide if I had ever seen certain landmarks before. Every now and then I paused to discover if any loud appeal was made to me, well knowing that in that dense and intensified atmosphere I should hear it a long way off. But no. The most extraordinary silence reigned in this immense gallery. Only the echoes of my own footsteps could be heard. At last I stopped. I could scarcely realize the fact of my isolation. I was quite willing to think that I had made a mistake, but not that I was lost. If I had made a mistake, I might find my way. If lost, I shuddered to think of it. Come, come, said I to myself, since there is only one road, and they must come by it, we shall at last meet. All I have to do is still go upwards. Perhaps, however, not seeing me and forgetting I was ahead, they may have gone back in search of me. Still, even in this case, if I make haste, I shall get up to them. There can be no doubt about the matter. But as I spoke these last words aloud, it would have been quite clear to any listener, had there been one, that I was by no means convinced of the fact. Moreover, in order to associate together these simple ideas and to reunite them under the form of reasoning required some time. I could not at all once bring my brain to think. Then another dread doubt fell upon my soul. After all, was I ahead? Of course I was. Hans was no doubt following behind, preceded by my uncle. I perfectly recollected his having stopped for a moment to strap his baggage to his shoulder. I now remembered this trifling detail. It was, I believe, just at that very moment that I had determined to continue my route. Again, thought I, reasoning as calmly as possible, there is another sure means of not losing my way, a thread to guide me through the labyrinth subterraneous retreat, one which I had forgotten, my faithful river. This course of reasoning roused my drooping spirits, and I resolved to resume my journey without further delay. No time was to be lost. It was at this moment that I had reason to bless the thoughtfulness of my uncle when he refused to allow the eider hunter to close the orifices of the hot spring, that small fissure in the great mass of granite. This beneficent spring, after having saved us from thirst during so many days, would now enable me to regain the right road. Having come to this mental decision, I made up my mind before I started upwards that ablution would certainly do me a great deal of good. I stopped to plunge my hands and forehead in the pleasant water of the Hansbach stream, blessing its presence as a certain consolation. Conceive my horror and stupefaction. I was treading a hard, dusty, shingly road of granite. The stream on which I reckoned had wholly disappeared. End of chapter 23. Recording by Simon Wainwright. Chapter 24 of Journey to the Center of the Earth. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Simon Wainwright. Journey to the Center of the Earth by Jules Verne. Chapter 24. Lost. No words in any human language can depict my utter despair. I was literally buried alive, with no other expectation before me but to live in all the slow, horrible torture of hunger and thirst. Mechanically I crawled about, feeling the dry, arid rock. Never to my fancy had I ever felt anything so dry. But I frantically asked myself, how had I lost the course of the flowing stream? There could be no doubt it had ceased to flow in the gallery in which I now was. Now I began to understand the cause of the strange silence which prevailed when last I tried, if any appeal from my companions might perchance reach my ear. It so happened that when I first took an imprudent step in the wrong direction, I did not perceive the absence of the all-important stream. It was now quite evident that when we halted, another tunnel must have received the waters of the little torrent, and that I had unconsciously entered a different gallery. To what unknown depths Had my companions gone? Where was I? How to get back? Clue or landmark? There was absolutely none. My feet left no signs on the granite and shingle. My brain throbbed with agony as I tried to discover the solution of this terrible problem. My situation, after all sophistry and reflection, had finally to be summed up in three awful words: lost, 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 lost at a depth which, to my finite understanding, appeared to be immeasurable. These 30 leagues of the crust of the earth weighed upon my shoulders like the globe of the shoulders of Atlas. I felt myself crushed by the awful weight. It was indeed a position to drive the sanest man to madness. I tried to bring my thoughts back to the things of the world so long forgotten. It was with the greatest difficulty that I succeeded in doing so. Hamburg, the house on the Konigstrasse, my dear cousin Gretchen, all that world which had before vanished like a shadow floated before my now vivid imagination. There they were before me, but how unreal! Under the influence of a terrible hallucination I saw all the incidents of our journey pass before me like the scenes of a panorama: the ship and its inmates, Iceland, M. Friedrichsson, and the great summit of Mount Sneffels. I said to myself that if in my position I retain the most faint and shadowy outline of a hope, it would be a sure sign of approaching delirium. It were better to give way wholly to despair. In fact, did I but reason with calmness and philosophy, what human power was there in existence able to take me back to the surface of the earth, and ready too to split asunder, to rend in twain those huge and mighty vaults which stand above my head? Who could enable me to find my road and regain my companions? Insensate folly and madness to entertain even a shadow of hope. "Oh, uncle!" was my despairing cry. This was the only word of reproach which came to my lips, for I thoroughly understood how deeply and sorrowfully the worthy professor would regret my loss, and how in his turn he would patiently seek for me. When I at last began to resign myself to the fact that no further aid was to be expected from man, and knowing that I was utterly powerless to do anything for my own salvation, I kneeled with earnest fervor and asked assistance from heaven. The remembrance of my innocent childhood, the memory of my mother, known only in my infancy, came welling forth from my heart. I had no recourse to prayer, and little as I had a right to be remembered by him whom I had forgotten in the hour of prosperity, and whom I so tardily invoked. I prayed earnestly and sincerely. This renewal of my youthful faith brought about a much greater amount of calm, and I was enabled to concentrate all my strength and intelligence on the terrible realities of my unprecedented situation. I had about me that which I had at first wholly forgotten: 3 days' provisions. Moreover, My water bottle was quite full. Nevertheless, the one thing which it was impossible to do was to remain alone. Try to find my companions I must, at any price. But which course should I take? Should I go upwards or again descend? Doubtless it was right to retrace my steps in an upward direction. By doing this with care and coolness, I must reach the point where I had turned away from the rippling stream. I must find the fatal bifurcation or fork. Once at this spot, once the river at my feet, I could at all events regain the awful crater of Mount Sneffels. Why had I not thought of this before? This at last was a reasonable hope of safety. The most important thing then to be done was to discover the bed of the Hansbach. After a slight meal and a draught of water, I rose like a giant refreshed. Leaning heavily on my pole, I began the ascent of the gallery. The slope was very rapid and rather difficult, but I advanced hopefully and carefully, like a man who at last is making his way out of a forest and knows there is only one road to follow. During one whole hour nothing happened to check my progress. As I advanced I tried to recollect the shape of the tunnel, to recall to my memory certain projections of rocks, to persuade myself that I had followed certain winding routes before, but no one particular sign could I bring to mind, and I was soon forced to allow that this gallery would never take me back to the point at which I had separated myself from my companions. It was absolutely without issue, a mere blind alley in the earth. The moment at length came when, facing the solid rock, I knew my fate and fell inanimate on the arid floor. To describe the horrible state of despair and fear into which I then fell would now be vain and impossible. My last hope, the courage which had sustained me, drooped before the sight of this pitiless granite rock. Lost in a vast labyrinth, the sinuosities of which spread in every direction without guide, clue, or compass, I knew it was a vain and useless task to attempt flight. All that remained to me was to lie down and die, to lie down and die. The most cruel and horrible of deaths. In my state of mind, the idea came into my head that one day, perhaps, when my fossil bones were found, their discovery so far below the level of the earth might give rise to solemn and interesting scientific discussions. I tried to cry aloud, but hoarse, hollow, and inarticulate sounds alone could make themselves heard through my parched lips. I literally panted for breath. In the midst of all these horrible sources of anguish and despair, a new horror took possession of my soul. My lamp, by falling down, had got out of order. I had no means of repairing it. Its light was already becoming paler and paler, and soon would expire. With a strange sense of resignation and despair, I watched the luminous current in the coil getting less and less. A procession of shadows moved, flashing along the granite wall. I scarcely dared to lower my eyelids, fearing to lose the last spark of this fugitive light. Every instant it seemed to me that it was about to vanish and to leave me forever in utter darkness. At last, one final trembling flame remained in the lamp. I followed it with all my power of vision. I gasped for breath. I concentrated upon it all the power of my soul, as upon the last scintillation of light I was ever destined to see, and then I was to be lost forever in Cimmerian and tenebrous shadows. A wild and plaintive cry escaped my lips. On earth, during the most profound and comparatively complete darkness, light never allows a complete destruction and extinction of its power. Light is so diffuse, so subtle, that it permeates everywhere, and whatever little may remain, the retina of the eye will succeed in finding it. In this place nothing, the absolute obscurity, made me blind in every sense. My head was now wholly lost. I raised my arms, trying the effects of the feeling in getting against the cold stone wall. It was painful in the extreme. Madness must have taken possession of me. I knew not what I did. I began to run, to fly, rushing at haphazard in this inextricable labyrinth, always going downwards, running wildly underneath the terrestrial crust, like an inhabitant of the subterranean furnaces, screaming, roaring, howling, until bruised by the pointed rocks, falling and picking myself up, all covered with blood, seeking madly to drink the blood which dripped from my torn features, mad because this blood only trickled over my face, and watching always for this horrid wall which were presented to me, the fearful obstacle against which I could not dash my head. Where was I going? It was impossible to say. I was perfectly ignorant of the matter. Several hours passed in this way. After a long time, having utterly exhausted my strength, I fell, a heavy, inert mass, along the side of the tunnel and lost consciousness. End of chapter 24. Recording by Simon Wainwright. Chapter 25 of Journey to the Center of the Earth. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Simon Wainwright. Journey to the Center of the Earth by Jules Verne. Chapter 25. The Whispering Gallery. When at last I came back to a sense of life and being, my face was wet, but wet, as I soon knew, with tears. How long this state of insensibility lasted, it is quite impossible for me now to say. I had no means left to me of taking any account of time. Never since the creation of the world had such a solitude as mine existed. I was completely abandoned. After my fall, I lost much blood. I felt myself flooded with the life-giving fluid. My first sensation was perhaps a natural one. Why was I not dead? Because I was alive there was something left to do. I tried to make up my mind to think no longer. As far as I was able, I drove away all ideas, and utterly overcome by pain and grief, I crouched against the granite wall. I just commenced to feel the fainting coming on again, and the sensation that this was the last struggle before complete annihilation, when, on a sudden, a violent uproar reached my ears. It had some resemblance to the prolonged rumbling voice of thunder, and I clearly distinguished sonorous voices, lost one after the other in the distant depths of the gulf. Whence came this noise? Naturally, it was to be supposed from new phenomena which were taking place in the bosom of the solid mass of Mother Earth. The explosion of some gaseous vapor, or the fall of some solid of the granite or other rock. Again I listened with deep attention. I was extremely anxious to hear if this strange and inexplicable sound was likely to be renewed. A whole quarter of an hour elapsed in painful expectation. Deep and solemn silence reigned in the tunnel, so still that I could hear the beatings of my own heart. I waited with a strange kind of hopefulness. Suddenly my ear, which leaned accidentally against the wall, appeared to catch, as it were, the faintest echo of a sound. I thought that I heard vague, incoherent, and distant voices. I quivered all over with excitement and hope. "It must be hallucination," I cried. "It cannot be. It is not true." But no, by listening more attentively, I really did convince myself that what I heard was truly the sound of human voices. To make any meaning out of the sound, however, was beyond my power. I was too weak even to hear distinctly. Still, it was a positive fact that someone was speaking. Of that I was quite certain. There was a moment of fear. A dread fell upon my soul that it might be my own words brought back to me by a distant echo. Perhaps, without knowing it, I might have been crying aloud. I resolutely closed my lips and once more placed my ear to the huge granite wall. Yes, for certain it was in truth the sound of human voices. I now, by the exercise of great determination, dragged myself along the sides of the cavern until I reached a point where I could hear more distinctly. But though I could detect the sound, I could only make out uncertain, strange, and incomprehensible words. They reached my ear as if they had been spoken in a low tone, murmured as if it were afar off. At last I made out the word "forlorad," repeated several times in a tone betokening great mental anguish and sorrow. What could this word mean, and who was speaking it? It must be either my uncle or the guide, Hans. If therefore I could hear them, they must surely be able to hear me. "Help!" I cried at the top of my voice. "Help! I am dying!" I then listened with scarcely a breath. I panted with the slightest sound in the darkness. A cry, a sigh, a question, but silence reigned supreme. No answer came. In this way some minutes passed. A whole flood of ideas flashed through my mind. I began to fear that my voice, weakened by sickness and suffering, could not reach my companions who were in search for me. It must be, they said. I cried, who else could by any possibility be buried 100 miles below the level of the earth? The mere supposition was preposterous. I began, therefore, to listen again with the most breathless attention. As I moved my ears along the side of the place I was in, I found a mathematical point, as it were, where the voices appeared to attain their maximum of intensity. The word "Florad" again distinctly reached my ear. Then came again that rolling noise like thunder which had awakened me out of my torpor. I begin to understand, I said to myself after some little time devoted to reflection. It is not through the solid mass that the sound reaches my ears. The walls of my cavernous retreat are of solid granite, and the most fearful explosion would not make uproar enough to penetrate them. The sound must come along the gallery itself. The place I was in must possess some peculiar acoustic properties of its own. Again I listened, and this time, yes, this time, I heard my name distinctly pronounced, cast as it were into space. It was my uncle, the professor, who was speaking. He was in conversation with the guide, and the word which had so often reached my ear, "forlorad," was a Danish word. Then I understood it all. In order to make myself heard, I too must speak, as it were, along the side of the gallery, which would carry the sound of my voice just as the wire carries the electric fluid from point to point. But there was no time to lose. If my companions were only to remove a few feet from where they stood, the acoustic effect would be over. My whispering gallery would be destroyed. I again, therefore, crawled towards the wall and said, as clearly and distinctly as I could, "Uncle Hardwigg." I then awaited a reply. Sound does not possess the property of traveling with such extreme rapidity. Besides, the density of the air at that depth from light and motion was very far from adding to the rapidity of circulation. Several seconds elapsed, which, to my excited imagination, appeared ages, and these words reached my eager ears and moved my wildly beating heart. "Harry, my boy, is that you?" A short delay between question and answer. "Yes, yes." "Where are you?" "Lost." "And your lamp?" "Out." "But the guiding stream?" "Is lost." "Keep your courage, Harry. We will do our best." "One moment, my uncle," I cried. "I have no longer strength to answer your questions, but for heaven's sake do you continue to speak to me. Absolute silence, I felt, would be annihilation." "Keep up your courage," said my uncle. "As you are so weak, do not speak. We have been searching for you in all directions, But by going upwards and downwards in the gallery, my dear boy, I had begun to give over all hope, and you can never know what bitter tears of sorrow and regret I have shed. At last, supposing you to be still on the road beside Hansbach, we again descended, firing off guns as signals. Now, however, we have found you, and that our voices reach each other, it may be a long time before we actually meet. We are conversing by means of some extraordinary acoustic arrangement of the labyrinth. But do not despair, my dear boy. It is something gained even to hear each other. While he was speaking, my brain was at work reflecting a certain undefined hope, vague and shapeless as yet, made my heart beat wildly. In the first place, it was absolutely necessary for me to know one thing. I once more, therefore, leaned my head against the wall, which I almost touched with my lips, and again spoke. "Uncle, my boy," was his answer after a few moments, "is it the utmost consequence that we should know how far we are asunder?" "That is not difficult." "You have your chronometer at hand?" I asked. "Certainly." "Well, take it into your hand, pronounce my name, noting exactly the second at which you speak. I will reply as soon as I hear your words, and you will then note exactly the moment at which my reply reaches you." "Very good. And the meantime between my question and your answer will be the time occupied by my voice in reaching you." "That is exactly what I mean, uncle," was my eager reply. "Are you ready?" "Yes." "Well, make ready. I am about to pronounce your name," said the professor. I applied my ear close to the sides of the cavernous gallery, and as soon as the word Harry reached my ear, I turned round and, placing my lips to the wall, repeated the sound. 40 seconds, said my uncle. There has elapsed 40 seconds between the two words. The sound, therefore, takes 20 seconds to ascend. Now, allowing 1,020 feet for every second, we have 20,400 feet, a league and a half, and 1/8. These words fell on my soul like a kind of death knell. A league and a half, I muttered in a low and despairing voice. It shall be got over, my boy, cried my uncle in a cheery tone. Depend on us. But do you know whether to ascend or descend? I asked faintly enough. We have to descend, and I will tell you why. You have reached a vast open space, a kind of bare crossroad from which galleries diverge in every direction. That in which you are now lying must necessarily bring you to this point, for it appears that all these mighty fissures, these fractures of the globe's interior, radiate from the vast cavern which we at this moment occupy. Rouse yourself then. Have courage and continue your route. Walk if you can. If not, drag yourself along. Slide if nothing else is possible. The slope must be rather rapid, and you will find strong arms to receive you at the end of your journey. Make a start like a good fellow." These words served to rouse some kind of courage in my sinking frame. "Farewell for the present, good uncle. I am about to take my departure. As soon as I start, our voices will cease to commingle. Farewell, then, until we meet again." "Adieu, Harry, until we say welcome." Sure were the last words which reached my anxious ears before I commenced my weary and almost hopeless journey. This wonderful and surprising conversation which took place through the vast mass of the earth's labyrinth, these words exchanged, the speakers being about 5 miles apart, ended with hopeful and pleasant expressions. I breathed one more prayer to heaven. I sent up words of thanksgiving, believing in my inmost heart that he had led me to the only place where the voices of my friends could reach my ears. This apparently astounding acoustic mystery is easily explainable by simple natural laws. It aroused from the conductibility of the rock. There are many instances of this singular propagation of sound, which are not perceptible in its less mediate positions. In the interior gallery of St. Paul's, and amid the curious caverns in Sicily, these phenomena are observable. The most marvelous of them all is known as the ear of Dionysus. These memories of the past, of my early reading and studies, came fresh to my thoughts. Moreover, I began to reason that if my uncle and I could communicate at such great a distance, no serious obstacle could exist between us. All I had to do was to follow the direction whence the sound had reached me, and, logically putting it, I must reach him if my strength did not fail. I accordingly rose to my feet. I soon found, however, that I could not walk, that I must drag myself along. The slope, as I expected, was very rapid, but I allowed myself to slip down. Soon the rapidity of the descent began to assume frightful proportions, and menaced a fearful fall. I clutched at the sides, I grasped at projections of rocks, I threw myself backwards, all in vain. My weakness was so great I could do nothing to save myself. Suddenly earth failed me. I was first launched into a dark and gloomy void. I then struck against the projecting asperities of a vertical gallery, a perfect well. My head bounded against a pointed rock, and I lost all knowledge of existence. As far as I was concerned, death had claimed me for his own. End of chapter 25. Reading by Simon Wainwright.